I'm Bill, owner of Magnum Airpower, and today I'm going to cover how to assemble and adjust the custom trigger casings. Now, this works whether you're using a plastic casing and installing custom trigger parts, or whether you're using the actual aluminum trigger casings that I have out now. So you have 3 pins, and just like the plastic casing, there's a center position for the transfer link, an upper position for the sear, and a position on the left for the trigger. Now, as I've mentioned in my first video, a lot of people like to use grease to lubricate these parts. Works very well with this trigger casing. If you're going to lighten your sear spring or use the very light compression spring, which is the return spring for the trigger, grease might give you a little bit too much resistance and make it feel a little gummy, so some people might prefer to use oil instead. I tend to use grease, but I use a very, very tiny amount of it. It tends to stay where you put it, which is really the advantage of using grease. The oil tends to settle away from the parts, and after a while they start to feel dry. So we have our first 3 pins in. Now the first thing I'm going to install is the little stainless steel extra light trigger return spring that comes with my custom trigger kits. I'm going to take, in this case it's an aluminum trigger, but I don't have any of these left. I've got stainless steel, brass, and I believe I have some black anodized aluminum triggers. But you lean the trigger forward when you're installing it, a little bit of an angle, so that the stud on the back of the trigger sits in front of that compression spring. And that way, once the trigger is in place, it'll compress that spring when you pull it back. Now, the transfer links that I'm using at this point in time are the original factory transfer links. But what I do with the custom trigger groups that I build and sell on my website, and the ones I build for myself, is I run these through a wire brush that I have attached to my bench grinder, and I sort of polish over the contact points, and I take the sharp edges and round them over a little and smooth out any roughness so that this will work a little smoother inside this casing. So install that in the center pin. Now, the custom sears, which I originally sold for the pistol trigger groups, these casings have been made so that they will fit these wider custom sears. They're approximately the same width as the custom triggers, so it reduces side-to-side wobble for both of those parts. I'm eventually going to make custom transfer links. So the next thing that we want to do is take the the sear spring, which also rests against the safety. This one, same thing, I ran it under a bench grinder on the wire brush, and I sort of polished up the end to take off the burr, smooth it out. I did the same thing with the hooked end and where the sear sits on it. I'm going to place that over the pin for the trigger, and the hooked part goes underneath the sear. Now you want it to go approximately across the middle of the hole for the safety, so that there's enough room on the left-hand side for this little outcrop here to sit on the side of the spring. Okay, so now the cover should just snap right in perfectly. So the next step is to install the 2 screws that hold in the cover. Now, especially because these are aluminum, you want to lubricate the screws. So I'm just going to take a little bit of my air gun oil, and I'm just going to put a drop on the tip of each screw. like to use bits instead of hex wrenches sometimes, but the hex wrench that you would need for these screws would be a 1/16. I'm going to use a 1/16 bit with a driver instead. Now they don't need to be real tight, just snug. They tend to stay put. So the next step, in order to adjust this with the screws for the trigger, you need to put the safety in. Now there's a little wire that you grab and pull forward. And then you put the small side, the small diameter side of your safety in from the opposite end. Just put it behind that wire to hold it forward. Then from the front, you grab that wire, pull it forward just enough to pop your safety all the way through. Now the safety will feel a little bit loose because there's not enough tension on that spring. If you push your sear down, you'll see it works really tight. So the next step is to install the 2 set screws, and that will apply tension to that spring wire so that the safety works properly. This trigger will not work without these screws in place to keep it from moving too far forward. So I'm going to use an 050 bit because it's a little easier to work with than the hex wrench, but you can also use an 050 hex wrench. And you place your set screw into the top threaded hole. And what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to have your safety engaged, so sticking all the way out to the right. If you were holding the gun, it would be to the right. And you're going to tighten this top screw, and you'll see the trigger moving as you tighten it. You're going to tighten it just very lightly, not too tight, until you feel it stop. At that point, your trigger is actually touching your safety. So what you want to do is turn that screw counterclockwise, loosen it just a hair so that your trigger doesn't wobble or move around significantly, but the safety will still work the way it's supposed to. Now, if you back it off too much, you're going to have a lot of slop in your trigger before it hits the safety. When you have the safety, or sorry, when you have the screw adjusted properly to where it stops, back it up a tiny bit, you don't have any loose wobble in the trigger, and the safety works smooth. That's your adjustment. So now for the bottom screw. This one adjusts how far back the trigger pulls. Now you're going to want to adjust this with the safety off. And as you can see, when you pull the trigger, it pulls the sear down. As you tighten the screw in, it starts to limit how far the sear pulls down. If you put it in far enough, it doesn't let the sear pull down at all, so the gun will not fire. So you need to back it off enough that the gun will fire. Now, the adjustment's going to vary from one gun to the next. So if you have this adjusted and you have it mounted on one, let's say a Discovery rifle or a 2260, and you pull this assembly off and put it on a different gun, it's going to change that setting just slightly of, where the gun will fire. So this being adjustable the way that it is is really helpful, especially for target shooters that want as little trigger movement as possible to get the gun to fire. So what I do, get these ready to ship out, is I use a tube and I hold the group just flush to the back of the tube. And if you look inside, I can see the sear. Don't think you're going to be able to catch that on camera, but maybe you can. When you pull the trigger, you can see the sear moving up and down. What I generally do is adjust it. You won't be able to see this part, but I adjust it looking through the tube until the sear pulls down just barely above flush with the tube. And that gives you a basic setting to start with. Now when I ship this out, you can leave it like that if you want. It'll fire fine and be a huge improvement over the plastic trigger groups. But you might want to tighten that in just a little bit more and feel where your hammer releases when you pull the trigger. Like I said, some people like it where the trigger only moves slightly and the hammer releases and pushes the sear down the rest of the way on its own. And that works really well depending on how strong your hammer spring is. So there's a little bit of room there to change how it releases the hammer. But in general, the way that I ship them out is a good standard setting. And like I said, a huge improvement over the original trigger group. So one thing I wanted to cover on this is the trigger pull. So with the safety off, got my trigger pull gauge here. Now I did a complete pull of the trigger, a little bit more than you'd need to do to actually fire the gun. And the trigger pull came out to 1 pound, 2.8 ounces. Now that's with an unlubricated trigger casing. I didn't put any grease or oil in this one. That does lower it a little bit. I've had these down to about 8 ounces is the lightest trigger pull that I've gotten out of one of these so far. The average is about this. It's between 1 and about 1.3, 1.4, somewhere in that range. Now that's just the trigger pull of the trigger group itself. Once you have your hammer pressing against the sear, that's going to increase the trigger pull. And the stronger your hammer spring is, the harder your trigger pull is going to be. So the reason why I bring this up is because I have one of these mounted on one of my guns, and it's mentioned on the website. It's a very powerful 25 caliber tank-fed gun based on the Discovery model, and it has a relatively heavy hammer spring, one of my 045 Magnum springs. And even with the spring at full tension to produce full power, that gun only has an 8-ounce trigger pull. The reason why is because the trigger is adjusted so that the sear only pulls down a tiny bit, and with the heavy hammer spring, the hammer forces the sear out of the way. So it only takes 8 ounces of pull on the trigger before the gun will fire. If you pull the trigger all the way back, as far as it will go, and you have it adjusted that the sear moves quite a bit, you're obviously going to have a little bit more trigger pull. So it's that little fine adjustment that makes the difference between having a 2 pound or a 3 pound trigger pull and a 6 or an 8 ounce trigger pull. And I wanted to bring that up, like I said, because customers often question the numbers that I post and think I'm either making them up or exaggerating. It's not. It's just that when you get things adjusted a certain way, or you do a little bit of extra tuning, it's going to change the numbers a little bit. Having a polished hammer, having a honed tube, those will reduce your trigger pull a little bit. Backing off on your hammer spring tension will reduce trigger pull a little bit. So those are just things to keep in mind if trigger pull is important to you. Okay, so this casing is one of the first ones that came off of a machine that was correct. And it didn't have any special finish on it. It was just the basic machining. I wanted it to look weathered, so I sprayed a little bit of oven cleaner on it and artificially aged the aluminum so that it looks a little old, a little weathered. It almost has a slightly corroded look to it, but that's just a chemical reaction. It's 70-75 aluminum. It's not going to corrode very easily. But the way that these are actually available on the website is with a matte finish, and that's the way that they look. I also have black anodized aluminum, matte finish. I have these brass ones that are made out of solid 360 brass. Now the weight on the aluminum ones, they're about 3.3 ounces each. The brass one is about 10.3 ounces, so it's quite a bit heavier. But these really look great. So those are the three different versions that I have available for these casings.